Welcome back to Lecture 23 on the Kennedy years. President Eisenhower served 2 terms in office, and we have a presidential election looming in 1960. There's a lot of things under debate with the 2 contenders for the presidency in 1960. The Republican Party will be struggling with a lot of criticism that it will receive that under Eisenhower's tenure in office, that the United States had not done enough to keep up with the so-called arms race with the Soviet Union. Some critics will say that under Republican leadership that the country had allowed the Soviet Union to begin stockpiling far greater numbers of atomic weapons, while the United States was lagging behind. A so-called missile gap had emerged. Critics also charged that the United States was falling behind in another way to the Soviet Union when it came to the so-called space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched their Sputnik satellite, and the Soviet Union beat the United States in its goal to try and place a man-made object in Earth around orbit. To some, this represented a crucial failing on the part of the United States' science and industry. Other critics on the left also took Eisenhower and the Republicans to task for the fact that poverty was increasing, especially in inner-city neighborhoods during this period, or criticizing Eisenhower for not doing enough to support the burgeoning civil rights movement in the United States. It was amidst these criticisms that we'll see the race for the White House in 1960 take place. The Republican nominee that year was Eisenhower's former vice president, Richard M. Nixon of California, and he's going to inherit a lot of the criticisms related to civil rights, Cold War foreign policy, and the space race. The Democratic challenger was John F. Kennedy from a wealthy and influential New England political family, and he will run on a platform of challenging the Republican Party's record on these issues: civil rights, as I said, Cold War foreign policy, and the so-called space race. Kennedy understood, though, that in order to enlist Southern white Democratic support, that he needed to choose someone that would appeal to them as his vice presidential nominee. So he will deliberately choose Lyndon B. Johnson, a native of Texas, to be his running mate in 1960 in a bid to garner Southern white support. Kennedy will also be a very vocal critic of the fact that the United States now, by 1959, had a communist neighbor living next door, that we see a revolution on the island of Cuba, and that this had all happened under Republican leadership. In sum, Kennedy's message on the campaign trail in 1960 was that as Americans, we can no longer, quote, drift. We must go forward. And these were compelling words for many Americans, especially once the public got a good look at the Democratic contender in a series of televised debates between Kennedy and Nixon. This still relatively new medium of television transmission will be quite important in determining who the next president will be in 1960. By 1960, the cost of producing televisions had dropped to the point where most Americans had their own television set. Even if they didn't, their neighbor did. And this is the first time we've seen 2 people competing for the presidency go in front of a television audience. Kennedy was the younger of the 2 men vying for office. He was 43 years old at the time, and comparing both candidates visually, which is what many Americans did, Kennedy seemed to embody the youthful optimism of a United States, whereas Nixon seemed kind of old and tired. He was kind of sweating heavily underneath the hot lights in the studio. And overwhelmingly, those who watched the debates between Nixon and Kennedy came away with a favorable impression of Kennedy. The Nixon-Kennedy debates, in other words, really sort of proved that Americans would be willing to cast their vote for someone based at least in part on the way that they looked, not just what their policy positions were. In fact, of those who listened to the debates only on radio, Nixon overwhelmingly was the favored candidate. Of those who watched the debates, though, on TV, Kennedy came out on top. In the end, John F. Kennedy, or JFK, as he is sometimes referred to, won, but by a fairly narrow margin of victory. Take a look, for example, at the slide, and you'll see that Kennedy ended up with 49.7% of the popular vote. Nixon ended up with 49.5% of the vote. We will see that one of the first priorities of the Kennedy administration will be trying to secure Latin America and prevent any further communist infiltration in the region. For that reason, in 1961, we will see a loan program rolled out known as the Alliance for Progress. The Kennedy administration will be offering some $20 billion in loans to help foster democracy in Latin America. Sort of like a Marshall Plan for the region in order to prevent the spread of communism. He hoped to contain communism to the island of Cuba, in other words, so that it wouldn't spread to other regions. And actually, he doesn't intend for Cuba to remain communist for long. I've already mentioned the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which was created under the Truman administration to stop the spread of communism abroad. We've already seen the CIA used many times during the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration to try to halt the spread of communism. In Iran, for instance, in 1953, the CIA helped overthrow the constitutional government there in a bid to install a leader that was anti-communist. We've seen the CIA used in Guatemala in 1954 to help bring down the popularly elected president there because the United States considered him a potential communist. So the Kennedy administration will not be pursuing a new policy, but rather just sort of stepping up a policy that Eisenhower had already begun, which is the United States going into other countries and deliberately trying to quash communist revolutions before they can begin. In Cuba, however, the communist revolution had already taken place. So in April of 1961, U.S. forces, mainly Cuban exiles, landed at the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba. What they were hoping to do is to initiate a large-scale uprising in Cuba against the Castro regime. They were supported and funded by the United States. However, the Kennedy administration's information was incorrect. When the Bay of Pigs invasion took place, the locals were not unhappy. They were not flocking to these U.S.-backed forces saying, please rescue us. In fact, the opposite took place. Very quickly, these invaders were rounded up by Cuban authorities, and the United States immediately backed off and claimed that they had nothing to do with supporting these counter-revolutionaries. Kennedy falsely claimed that it was simply Cubans fighting Cubans, that the United States had no role to play in instigating this invasion, but everyone knew that that was not the case. Later, Kennedy privately admitted to one of his advisors, "I have made a tragic mistake. Not only were our facts in error, but our policy was wrong." That, however, did not stop he and his military advisors from continuing a number of assassination attempts against the Cuban leader, Fidel Castro. And Kennedy will not be the only president to do that. There will be many, many failed assassination attempts to try and take down the communist leader of Cuba over the decades. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had remained high for more than a decade under Eisenhower's leadership. But these tensions will really spike after the Cuba debacle, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. By this point, though, Joseph Stalin has passed away, and it is now Nikita Khrushchev who is the Soviet premier. He viewed Kennedy's actions in the case of the Bay of Pigs invasion as a violation of Cuban sovereignty as a way to try and get back at the Soviet Union for supporting Castro's regime. And so he's upset about that. He is also very much worried about the fate of Germany after the war. By 1960, you've seen hundreds of thousands of people living in East Germany, the Soviet-dominated country of East Germany, fleeing that communist regime. Where are they going? Many of them are going to West Germany, which will enjoy the support of Western powers such as the United States and Great Britain and France. Why are so many people leaving? Some of it is a lack of a political voice. Some of it is that wages have stagnated in East Germany. The Soviet Union after World War II basically stripped the industrial infrastructure of East Germany and sent all of that heavy equipment and machinery back to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in other words, will have sort of deliberately hobbled or crippled East Germany. Deliberately meaning that they don't want Germany to be reunited, and they certainly do not want to have a reunited Germany that would support the United States and capitalism. So I say all this because I want you to understand why Khrushchev was a proponent of erecting a physical barrier through the city of Berlin, Germany, the so-called Berlin Wall. You've got residents of this city that it is arbitrarily divided between a Soviet sector in the east and a West Berlin, which is supported by many of the Western powers, the United States, Great Britain, and the like. You have seen a net brain drain over the decade after the conclusion of the Second World War. You've seen some of the finest doctors, scientists, businessmen simply leaving East Germany or East Berlin, the city, and moving to West Berlin. Khrushchev wants to put a stop to it. During the summer of 1961, a permanent barrier will be erected between the eastern half of the city of Berlin and the western half of the city of Berlin. And this barrier will now be patrolled by Red Army soldiers. There are only several checkpoints, and you must have proper permission to now move between both sectors of the city. This was tragic for the people who lived on the ground in Berlin. Many of them had traveled freely prior to this to visit family members or to take care of their businesses or what have you. Now, free access is forever closed off. If you don't have permission, you can't get from one sector of the city to another. So this will cut people off from their families, from their livelihoods, and those who will attempt to cross the wall without permission will be shot dead on sight by Soviet soldiers. The Berlin Wall, therefore, becomes a very potent symbol of the inflexibility between the Soviet Union and the United States and its Western allies. It just becomes kind of a perfect lens for understanding how intractable things had become between both sides in 1961. Coming back to the Western Hemisphere, we're going to see that the Kennedy administration will be closely monitoring Cuba, our communist neighbor to the south. In October of 1962, U.S. spy planes flying over the island confirmed that there were missile launching sites that had been erected in Cuba. The Kennedy administration determined that these missile silos were being created to house atomic weapons. This is unacceptable to the Kennedy administration. As you can see from the map that I have here on the slide, if these missiles from the Soviet Union, that's who was supplying them, if these missiles were delivered to the island and installed in these missile silos, then the Soviet Union now, through Cuba, would be able to reach much of the eastern part of the United States if they launched an atomic attack based off the island of Cuba. Kennedy will order U.S. sailors to blockade to forcibly prevent any Soviet ships from delivering weapons to the island. These are tense times, and many historians believe that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest that the United States and the Soviet Union ever got to the edge of nuclear war. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and eventually the Soviet Union turned its ships back